Roy Renard stepped through the front door of his suburban home, work boots heavy against the hardwood floor. The scent of dinner cooking should have welcomed him, but instead the house felt hollow. Empty. He set his toolbox down and listened to the silence that greeted him every evening now. "Jean," his voice echoed through the hallway. In the kitchen came her reply, but it sounded distant, rehearsed. He found her standing at the stove, stirring something in a pot while staring at her phone. The same position she'd been in for weeks now. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, her yoga clothes pristine despite claiming she'd been home all day working. "How was your day?" Roy asked, washing his hands at the sink. Jean glanced up for half a second. "Fine. Busy. Had some client calls." "Which clients?" "Just some freelance stuff. You wouldn't know them." She turned back to her phone, thumbs moving quickly across the screen. Roy dried his hands slowly, watching her. The phone was face down on the counter when he'd walked in, but now she held it close to her chest like a shield. In 8 years of marriage, Jean had never been secretive about anything. She used to share every detail of her day, every conversation, every thought that crossed her mind. "Where's Mason?" he asked. "Upstairs doing homework." Roy nodded and headed toward the stairs. "Mason? Dad's home." The sound of small feet running across the floor above was the first genuine warmth he'd felt all day. 8-year-old Mason appeared at the top of the stairs, his face lighting up with a smile that reminded Roy why he worked so hard to keep this family together. "Dad, look what I drew today." Mason bounded down the stairs, clutching a piece of construction paper. Roy knelt down as Mason reached him, studying the crayon drawing. It showed their house, green grass, blue sky, and stick figures standing in front. But something was wrong. "Tell me about your picture, buddy." "That's our house." Mason pointed with his finger. "That's you, that's me, that's Mommy, and that's Mommy's friend." Roy's stomach tightened, for figures stood in front of the house. "Mommy's friend? Yeah, he comes over sometimes when you're at work. He's really tall and wears fancy clothes. Mommy says he helps her with work stuff." From the kitchen came the sound of a pot clattering against the stove. Roy looked up to see Jean standing in the doorway, her face pale. "Mason, why don't you go wash your hands for dinner?" she said quickly. "But I wanted to show Dad my." "Now, Mason." The boy's shoulders slumped, but he obeyed, trudging up the stairs. Roy stood slowly, the drawing still in his hand. "Work stuff?" he asked. Jean's jaw tightened. "It's nothing, Roy. Just a colleague who stops by occasionally." "What's his name?" "Aaron. Dr. Aaron Kells. He's helping me with some consulting work." Roy had never heard the name before. In their marriage, Jean had always introduced him to her friends, her colleagues, anyone who mattered in her life. The fact that this man was apparently close enough to visit their home, to be noticed by their son, yet Roy had never met him or even heard his name mentioned, sent warning signals through his mind. "I'd like to meet him sometime," Roy said. "Maybe." Jean turned back toward the kitchen. "Dinner's ready." During the meal, Jean talked about vacation plans, about a new yoga instructor she'd started working with, about Mason's upcoming school events. Her voice carried the same cheerful tone it always had, but Roy noticed how she avoided his eyes, how she kept glancing at her phone, which sat face down beside her plate. Mason chattered about his day at school, about his friends, about a science project he was excited to work on. But even he seemed quieter than usual, as if he could sense the tension that had been building in the house for weeks. After dinner, Roy helped Mason with his homework while Jean cleaned the kitchen. When he came back downstairs, she was gone. He found her in the garage, standing near her car with her back to him. She was talking in a low voice, almost whispering. Roy stepped closer, staying in the shadows. "He's clueless," Jean was saying, a soft laugh in her voice. "Completely clueless. You're right about everything." Roy's blood turned cold. He moved closer, careful to stay out of sight. I know. It's just harder than I thought it would be," Jean continued. "But you're right. I deserve better than this. I deserve to be happy." Roy saw the phone pressed to her ear. Not her regular phone. This one was smaller, sleeker, gold-colored. "Tomorrow, then. Same time, same place." "And Aaron? Thank you. For everything." When she noticed movement behind her, Jean spun around. Her eyes widened when she saw Roy standing there. "Oh, you scare me." She quickly ended the call and slipped the phone into her pocket. I was just work stuff. Conference call with a client on the East Coast. At 9:30 at night. Different time zones, you know how it is. Roy stared at her. This woman he'd loved for 8 years. This woman who'd stood beside him at their wedding and promised to be honest and faithful. The woman who'd given him Mason, the most precious thing in his world. I've never seen that phone before, he said. It's new. For work. Separate line for clients. Jean brushed past him toward the house. I'm tired. I'm going to bed. Roy watched her go, then stood alone in the garage for a long time. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the concrete floor. He thought about the drawing Mason had made, about the fourth figure standing with their family. He thought about the name Aaron Kells and wondered why a doctor would be making house calls to discuss consulting work. But mostly, he thought about the laugh in Jean's voice when she'd said he was clueless. It hadn't sounded like the woman he'd married. It had sounded like a stranger. The next morning brought a return to normalcy that felt forced. Jean made pancakes, hummed while she cooked, asked Roy about his plans for the weekend. She played the role of loving wife and mother with such perfection that he almost convinced himself he'd imagine the conversation in the garage. Almost. I was thinking we could take Mason to the coast this weekend, she said, placing a plate in front of him. He's been asking about the ocean. That sounds good. Roy cut into his pancakes, watching Jean move around the kitchen. We could leave Friday night, get an early start on Saturday. Perfect. Jean smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Mason bounded into the kitchen, already dressed for school, his backpack slung over one shoulder. Mom, can I take my new art supplies for show and tell today? He asked. We'll see, sweetheart. Eat your breakfast first. Roy watched his son pour syrup over his pancakes with a careful concentration only an 8-year-old could muster. Mason was the bright spot in his life, the one thing that made all the long hours at the construction site worth it. The boy had Jean's quick smile and Roy's steady nature, and watching him grow had been the greatest joy of Roy's adult life. Dad, are you coming to my parent-teacher conference next week? Mason asked. Wouldn't miss it, buddy. Ms. Pike wants to talk about my reading. She says I'm doing really good. Really well? Jean corrected automatically. Really well. Mason repeated with a grin. After Roy dropped Mason off at school, he drove to the construction site where his crew was working on a new office building. The familiar sounds of machinery and hammering usually cleared his head, but today he couldn't shake the image of Jean standing in the garage with that secret phone. You look like hell, said Jace Holler, Roy's second-in-command and closest friend on the crew. Thanks. You always know how to brighten my day. Jace was 39, the same age as Roy, with calloused hands and a face weathered by years of outdoor work. He'd been married to his wife Linda for 15 years and had 3 kids. If anyone understood the pressures of balancing work and family, it was Jace. Seriously, though, what's eating at you? Roy considered brushing off the question, but Jace had always been someone he could trust. Something's wrong at home. I can feel it. With Jean. Yeah. Roy picked up a blueprint and pretended to study it. She's been different lately. Distant. Secretive. Women go through phases. Linda once spent 3 weeks rearranging every room in our house for no reason I could figure out. This isn't about redecorating. Roy set down the blueprint. She's got a second phone. Talks on it when she thinks I'm not around. Jace's expression grew serious. That's not good. No, it's not. You think she's... I don't know what to think. But something's coming. I can feel it. That evening, Roy arrived home to find Jean in an unusually good mood. She made his favorite dinner and had wine opened and waiting. Mason showed him a math test with a perfect score, and for a few hours, Roy let himself believe that maybe he'd been wrong. Maybe the stress of work was making him paranoid. But later that night, after Mason was asleep and Jean had gone to bed early claiming a headache, Roy sat in his home office and tried to log into their joint bank account online. The password had been changed. He tried their anniversary date, Mason's birthday, Jean's maiden name. Nothing worked. When he attempted to reset the password, the system told him the recovery email had been changed to an address he didn't recognize. Roy leaned back in his chair, staring at the computer screen. Jean had handled most of their finances for years. It was one less thing for him to worry about after long days at work. But now, locked out of his own accounts, he realized how much control he'd given her, how vulnerable that made him. He opened a new browser window and created accounts at 2 other banks. If Jean was planning something, he needed to be prepared. He thought about his father, who'd been blindsided when Roy's mother left with half of everything they'd built. Roy had sworn he'd never let himself be that unprepared. The next morning, he made excuses to leave work early and drove to the main branch of their bank. The teller, a young woman with a helpful smile, pulled up their account information. "I can see there have been several large transfers in the past month," she said, scrolling through the screen. "All authorized by Mrs. Renard with proper identification. Transfers to where?" "I'm sorry, Mr. Renard, but I can only discuss those details with the account holder who made the transactions." Roy felt his jaw clench. "This is a joint account." "Yes, but Mrs. Renard has added enhanced security features that require her authorization for certain disclosures." Roy left the bank with more questions than answers. Jean had moved their money somewhere, and she made sure he couldn't find out where or why. Whatever was happening, she'd been planning it for weeks. Meanwhile, across town at an upscale cafe with exposed brick walls and carefully curated vintage decor, Jean Renard sat across from Dr. Erin Kells. She wore a blue dress that brought out her eyes and had styled her hair in loose waves that framed her face. To any observer, they looked like a professional meeting between colleagues. Erin was exactly the kind of man who commanded attention in a room. Tall and lean with silver threading through his dark hair, he wore an expensive suit that fit him perfectly. His voice was smooth and cultured, the kind that made people lean in to listen. "You look tense," he said, reaching across the table to touch her hand. "Roy's been asking questions. About you. About my phone." "What kind of questions?" "He knows I have a second phone. He heard me talking last night." Jean's voice shook slightly. "He wanted to know who you were, why you come to the house." Erin's fingers traced over her knuckles. "What did you tell him?" "That you're helping me with consulting work. That it's nothing important." "And he believed you?" "I think so. But Erin, what if he finds out about us? What if he—" "Jean." Erin's voice was calm, authoritative. "Look at me." She met his eyes, those deep brown eyes that had first captivated her 4 months ago when she'd started therapy sessions to deal with what she'd thought was depression. "You've been living as a prisoner in your own home for 8 years, Erin continued. "Roy controls the money, makes all the decisions, treats you like a housekeeper instead of a partner. You've told me this yourself. I know, but you deserve control over your own life. You deserve to be with someone who sees your worth, who appreciates your intelligence and beauty." Jean felt the familiar warmth of his words, the way he made her feel special and understood. Before Erin, she'd never questioned her marriage. She thought she was happy, or at least content. But he'd shown her what she was missing, what she deserved. "The plan is already in motion," Erin said. "You've documented the emotional abuse, the financial control. We have witnesses who can testify to Roy's anger issues. But what about Mason? I don't want to hurt him. You're protecting him. Children shouldn't grow up watching their mother be diminished and controlled. You're showing him what a strong woman looks like." Erin leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You need to start documenting everything more clearly. Record your conversations with Roy. Capture his anger on video. The courts need to see who he really is." Jean nodded, though something in her chest felt tight. "He's never actually hit me. Emotional abuse is just as damaging. And for what you've told me about his temper, his controlling behavior, it's only a matter of time before it escalates. What if Mason says something? What if Roy starts asking him questions? Children adapt. And once you have full custody, you can help Mason understand that sometimes adults have to make difficult choices to protect the people they love." Jean sipped her coffee, trying to calm her nerves. Everything Erin said made sense. He was a trained psychologist, someone who understood human behavior better than she ever could. If he said this was the right path, then it had to be. "I transferred more money yesterday," she said. "Another 5,000. Good. You'll need financial resources when this goes to court. Roy won't make it easy. The account you set up is secure?" "Completely. He'll never find it." Erin smiled, the expression warm and reassuring. "Trust me, Jean. I've guided other women through this process. You're going to come out of this stronger and free. After their meeting, Erin walked Jean to her car, kissing her goodbye in the shadows of the parking garage. She drove home with her heart racing, practicing the words she would say if Roy asked about her afternoon. But when she arrived, Roy wasn't there. Mason was at soccer practice, and the house was empty. She found a note on the kitchen counter. Gone to hardware store. Back by 6. Jean went upstairs to their bedroom and pulled out her secret phone. She scrolled through the messages from Aaron, reading his encouragement, his promises of their future together. Then she opened her laptop and created a new document. Incidents of emotional abuse, Roy Renard. She started typing, documenting every argument they'd had in recent months, every time Roy had seemed frustrated or stressed. She described his controlling behavior, his insistence on managing their finances, his long hours at work that left her feeling isolated and alone. As she wrote, she began to see her marriage through Aaron's eyes. Roy wasn't the steady, reliable husband she'd thought he was. He was controlling and distant, someone who took her for granted and made her feel small. By the time Roy came home, Jean had convinced herself that everything Aaron said was true. She was a victim who deserved better, and it was time to take control of her life. That evening, Roy noticed that Mason seemed quieter than usual at dinner. The boy picked at his food and kept glancing between his parents as if he could sense the tension in the air. "Everything okay, buddy?" Roy asked. Mason nodded, but he didn't speak. After dinner, while Jean was giving Mason a bath, Roy's phone rang. The caller ID showed Mason's school. "Mr. Renard? This is Ms. Pike, Mason's teacher." "Hi, Ms. Pike. Is everything all right? I want to talk to you about Mason's behavior lately. He's been having some difficulty concentrating, and there have been a few incidents where he seemed upset or worried." Roy felt his stomach drop. "What kind of incidents?" "He's been drawing some concerning pictures during art time, images that suggest he might be experiencing stress at home. And yesterday, he told another student that his mommy cries when his daddy comes home from work. He said what? I don't want to alarm you, Mr. Renard, but in my experience, children often act out when there's conflict in the home. I was wondering if you and Mrs. Renard might be going through a difficult time." Roy looked toward the stairs, where he could hear Jean's voice reading Mason a bedtime story. "We'll figure it out, Miss Pike. Thank you for calling." After he hung up, Roy sat in the quiet kitchen and tried to make sense of everything that was happening. His wife was hiding money and carrying a secret phone. His son was telling people that his mother cried when his father came home. Someone named Aaron Kells was visiting their house while Roy was at work. The pieces didn't fit together in any way that made sense, but Roy knew one thing for certain. His family was falling apart, and he had no idea how to stop it. 3 weeks later, the tension in the Renard house had reached a breaking point. Roy worked longer hours to avoid the uncomfortable silences at home, but that only seemed to make things worse. Jean grew more distant, more secretive, and Mason's behavior at school continued to worry his teacher. Roy decided to try a direct approach. He found Jean in the living room one evening, scrolling through her phone while the television played in the background. She looked up when he entered, but her expression was guarded. "We need to talk," Roy said, sitting down across from her. "About what?" "About us. About whatever's been going on between us." Jean set down her phone, but kept it close to her side. "I don't know what you mean." "Jean, come on. We've been married 8 years. I know when something's wrong." Roy leaned forward, trying to catch her eyes. "If I've done something, if there's a problem we need to work through, just tell me." For a moment, Jean's mask slipped. He saw something in her face, guilt, maybe your fear. But then her expression hardened. "You want to know what's wrong?" she said, her voice rising. "I feel like a prisoner in my own home, Roy. You control everything, the money, the decisions, what we do, where we go. I have no say in my own life." Roy stared at her. "That's not true. We make decisions together." "Do we? When's the last time you asked my opinion about anything important? When's the last time you treated me like an equal partner instead of someone who just happens to live in your house?" "Jean, where's this coming from? I've never. You've ruined my life, Roy." Her voice was cold now, final. "You just don't see it yet." The words hit him like a physical blow. Roy sat back, trying to process what he'd just heard. This wasn't the woman he'd married, the woman who'd once told him he was her best friend, her safe harbor in the world. I don't understand, he said quietly. Of course you don't. You never understand anything that doesn't revolve around you and your work. Jean stood up, clutching her phone. I'm going to bed. Don't wake me when you come up. Roy sat alone in the living room for a long time after she left, her words echoing in his head. He tried to remember when things had started to change, when the woman who'd once laughed at his jokes and fallen asleep in his arms had become this stranger who looked at him with such cold contempt. The next morning, Roy drove to work in silence, Jean's accusations playing on repeat in his mind. When he arrived at the construction site, Jace took one look at him and shook his head. It's getting worse, isn't it? She says I've ruined her life. Jesus, Roy. I keep trying to figure out what I did wrong when things changed, but I can't pinpoint it. Jace pulled off his hard hat and ran a hand through his graying hair. Look, I'm no expert on marriage, but Linda and I have had our rough patches. Usually when she starts picking fights about everything, it means there's something else going on. Something she doesn't want to talk about directly. Like what? Could be anything. Maybe she's feeling unappreciated. Maybe she's going through some kind of personal crisis. Or maybe, Jace hesitated. Maybe what? Maybe there's someone else. Roy had been trying not to think about that possibility, but hearing it spoken aloud made his chest tighten. The phone calls. The secret meetings. You said this errand guy comes to your house. According to Mason, yeah, when I'm at work. That doesn't sound like business to me. Roy spent the rest of the day trying to concentrate on work, but his mind kept wandering. That evening, he made a decision. If Jean was planning something, if she was preparing to leave him or take Mason away, he needed to know. He needed to be prepared. He started documenting everything. He wrote down the dates and times of Jean's strange phone calls, the changes in their bank accounts, Mason's concerning behavior at school. He took photos of Jean's second phone when she left it unattended. He saved voicemails, text messages, any evidence that might be relevant later. Roy had learned the importance of preparation from his father's mistakes. When his mother had left, his father had been caught completely off guard. He'd lost the house, most of his savings, and Roy had been forced to live with relatives for 2 years while his father got back on his feet. Roy wouldn't let that happen to Mason. Whatever Jean was planning, he would be ready for it. 2 weeks later, Roy was reviewing blueprints in his trailer office when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Mason's school, and Roy felt his stomach clench. Ms. Pike had called twice in the past month about Mason's behavior, and each conversation had been more concerning than the last. Mr. Renard? Ms. Pike's voice sounded tight, professional, but underneath there was something else. Discomfort. Could you come to the school right away? Is Mason hurt? No, he's not hurt, but it's about your son and about your wife. Roy was already reaching for his keys. I'll be right there. The drive to Mason's elementary school usually took 15 minutes, but Roy made it in 10. He parked quickly and hurried toward the main office, his heart pounding. Through the windows, he could see children in the hallways, changing classes, laughing and talking. Normal 8-year-old behavior that seemed impossibly far from whatever crisis was waiting for him. Ms. Pike met him at the classroom door. Hannah Pike was 29, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that made her popular with both students and parents. But today, her face was pale and drawn, and she kept glancing toward Mason's desk. Thank you for coming so quickly, she said. I wasn't sure. I debated whether to call you at all. What happened? Ms. Pike gestured toward Mason's desk, where the boy sat holding something in his hands. It's show and tell day. Mason brought something that, well, perhaps you should see for yourself. Roy approached his son's desk, noting how quiet the other children had become. Mason looked up at him with wide, uncertain eyes. Hi, Dad. I didn't know you were coming to school today. Miss Pike called me, buddy. She said you brought something for show and tell. Mason held up a sleek, gold-colored phone. Roy's blood turned to ice. I found Mommy's secret phone, Mason said proudly. She always hides it, but she left it on the kitchen counter this morning. I thought it would be cool to show everyone. Miss Pike's voice was barely a whisper. I shouldn't have looked, but when Mason started his presentation, he was showing the other children the messages on the screen. I had to see what they were looking at. Roy reached for the phone with hands that weren't quite steady. The screen was still lit, showing a conversation between Jean and someone named Aaron. Roy's vision blurred as he read the messages. He'll never see it coming. I'll get full custody. Make sure you record the next fight. You need proof. He'll crack. He always does. There were dozens of messages spanning weeks. Plans for custody battles, discussions about Roy's supposed anger issues, strategies for documenting abuse that Roy knew had never happened. Mr. Renard? Ms. Pike's voice seemed to come from very far away. There's more. She scrolled down to a photo that made Roy's legs go weak. It showed Mason crying, but the image looked staged, artificial. Attached to it was an audio recording. Ms. Pike hesitated, then pressed play. Jean's voice filled the quiet classroom. Say, Daddy hit you, sweetheart. Just once. Can you do that for Mommy? Mason's voice, small and confused. But Daddy didn't hit me. I know, baby, but sometimes grown-ups have to pretend things to protect the people they love. Can you say it? Just this once. The recording cut off. Roy stared at the phone, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. His wife, the mother of his child, was coaching Mason to lie about abuse that had never happened. I already called child services, Ms. Pike said quietly. For Mason's safety. I had to. Roy looked at his son, who was watching him with worried eyes. Dad, are you okay? You look funny. I'm fine, buddy. Roy's voice didn't sound like his own. Ms. Pike, I need to speak with you privately. They stepped into the hallway, leaving Mason with the teacher's aide. How long has this been going on? Roy asked. I don't know. This is the first time Mason has brought the phone to school. But Mr. Renard, some of those messages go back weeks. There are detailed plans about custody hearings, about documenting incidents of abuse. Ms. Pike paused. Are you being abused by your wife? The question was so absurd that Roy almost laughed. No, Jean has never laid a hand on me. But the messages suggest. The messages are lies. Roy's voice was harder than he intended. All of it. Jean and this Aaron person are planning to fabricate abuse allegations to get custody of Mason. Ms. Pike stared at him. Why would they do that? Roy thought about the secret meetings, the hidden phone, the money Jean had been moving to accounts he couldn't access. I think my wife is having an affair, and I think she wants to take everything I have. For the first time, Roy realized that this wasn't just betrayal. It wasn't even just about an affair or the end of his marriage. This was war, and he was just now understanding that the battle had been going on for months without his knowledge. What happens now, he asked. Child services will investigate. They'll want to interview you, your wife, and Mason. The police may get involved if they determine that false allegations were being planned. Roy nodded, his mind already working through the implications. Ms. Pike, I need to ask you a favor. Can you keep this phone secure? Can you make sure the messages don't get deleted? Of course. I'll turn it over to the authorities. And Ms. Pike, thank you for protecting my son. She managed a small smile. That's what teachers do. That evening, Jean returned home to find the house empty. No Mason playing in the living room. No Roy's work boots by the front door. No sound of dinner cooking in the kitchen. Just silence and a single piece of paper on the kitchen table. She picked up the note with trembling hands. You wanted evidence. I've got plenty. Jean's knees gave out, and she sank into a chair. He knew. Somehow, Roy knew about everything. About Aaron, about the phone, about their plans. Her hand shook as she dialed Aaron's number. Jean, you sound upset. He knows, Aaron. Roy knows everything. The house is empty, Mason's gone, and there's a note. Slow down. What kind of note? Jean read him Roy's message, her voice breaking on the last word. Where would he take Mason? Aaron asked. I don't know. Maybe to his friend Jace's house. Maybe to a hotel. Aaron, what are we going to do? Stick to the plan. This doesn't change anything. Doesn't change anything? He has evidence. He knows we were planning to. Jean, listen to me. You're panicking, and panic makes people make mistakes. We prepared for this possibility. No, we didn't. We never talked about what would happen if he found out before we were ready. The plan still works. You document the abuse. You file for custody. You protect yourself and Mason from Roy's anger. The fact that he's taken Mason and left threatening notes only supports our case. Jean wanted to believe him, but fear was clouding her thoughts. What if he goes to the police? What if he shows them the messages? What messages? You told me you were careful about what you put in writing. Jean closed her eyes, trying to remember exactly what she'd said in their text conversations. Had she been specific about their plans? Had she mentioned anything that could be used against her? "I need to see you," she said. "Can you come over?" "I don't think that's wise. If Roy is watching the house." "Please, Aaron. I can't do this alone." There was a pause. "All right, but we need to be careful. If anyone sees us together right now, it could complicate things." An hour later, Aaron's BMW pulled into the Renard driveway. Jean met him at the door, falling into his arms with relief. "It's going to be okay," he murmured, stroking her hair. "We'll figure this out." They sat on the living room couch, the same couch where Jean and Roy had argued just weeks before. Aaron held her hand while she explained everything that had happened. Coming home to the empty house, finding Roy's note, the growing fear that their plan was falling apart. "The most important thing is that we stick to our story," Aaron said. "Roy is controlling and emotionally abusive. You've been documenting incidents for weeks. His behavior tonight, taking Mason and leaving threatening notes, only proves what you've been saying. But what if he has recordings? What if he has proof that we were lying? He doesn't. We were careful." Jean wished she felt as confident as Aaron sounded. Something in Roy's note, the cold certainty of it, suggested that he knew more than they'd realized. Meanwhile, across town at Jace Holler's house, Roy sat at the kitchen table with Mason coloring beside him while Jace and his wife Linda prepared dinner. Detective Mira Hines had arrived an hour earlier to take Roy's statement, and now she was reviewing the contents of Jean's secret phone. Mira Hines was 46, with sharp eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She'd been investigating domestic cases for over 15 years, and she'd learned to be skeptical of everyone's version of events until she saw hard evidence. Initially, when Child Services had called about potential abuse in the Renard household, she'd assumed Roy was the perpetrator. In her experience, when there were allegations of domestic violence, the husband was usually the problem. But the phone Ms. Pike had turned over told a very different story. "Mr. Renard," she said, looking up from the device. "These messages span over 2 months. Your wife and Dr. Kells have been planning this for a long time." "Planning what exactly?" "From what I can see, they were going to fabricate evidence of domestic abuse, use it to get Mrs. Renard full custody of your son, and presumably divorce you with a significant financial settlement." Roy felt a cold fury building in his chest. "And Aaron Kells? What's his role in this?" "Dr. Kells appears to be your wife's lover, but he's also been coaching her on how to manipulate the legal system. There are messages here where he gives very specific advice about how to document fake incidents, how to coach your son to lie about abuse, how to hide assets." "Is that legal? For a therapist to give that kind of advice?" "Not even close. Dr. Kells has violated multiple ethical standards and probably several laws. His license will be revoked, and he may face criminal charges." Detective Hines set down the phone and looked at Roy with something that might have been sympathy. "I have to ask, Mr. Renard, have you ever struck your wife or your son?" "Never." "Have you ever threatened them or engaged in controlling behavior?" Roy thought about Jean's accusations, about her claims that he controlled their finances and made all the decisions. "I manage our bank accounts because Jean said she didn't want to deal with bills and budgets. I work long hours because construction jobs don't wait. But I've never threatened anyone, and I've never tried to control my wife." "The financial records will tell us a lot. If Mrs. Renard has been moving money without your knowledge, that supports your version of events. She changed our passwords. I can't access our accounts. We'll sort that out. In the meantime, what are your plans? Where will you and your son stay tonight?" Roy looked at Mason, who was carefully coloring a picture of a dinosaur. His son seemed calmer here than he had at home in weeks. "Jace and Linda said we could stay here as long as we need to." "Good. I'd recommend avoiding contact with your wife until we've completed our investigation." "And Mr. Renard?" "Document everything. Every phone call, every message, every interaction. If this goes to court, you'll want a complete record." After Detective Hines left, Roy helped Mason get ready for bed in Jace's guest room. The boy seemed to sense that something important was happening, but he was too young to understand the full scope of what his mother had been planning. "Dad, are we going home tomorrow?" "I don't know yet, buddy. We might stay here for a few days. Is Mommy in trouble? Roy sat on the edge of the small bed, choosing his words carefully. Mommy made some bad choices, but that doesn't mean she doesn't love you. Did I do something wrong? By bringing the phone to school? No, Mason. You didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, and other grown-ups have to help fix them. After Mason fell asleep, Roy sat in the guest room and tried to process everything that had happened. 24 hours ago, he'd been a married man trying to save his relationship. Now he was essentially a single father. His wife was under investigation for fraud and conspiracy, and his entire life had been turned upside down. But for the first time in months, Roy felt like he could see clearly. The fog of confusion and self-doubt that had clouded his thinking was gone. He understood now what he was up against, and he knew exactly what he had to do. Jean and Aaron had been planning to destroy him using lies and manipulation. They'd been prepared to sacrifice Mason's emotional well-being to get what they wanted. They'd underestimated him, assuming he would be blindsided and helpless when their plan came to light. They were wrong. Roy Renard had grown up in a house where weakness was punished and strength was the only thing that mattered. He learned early that the world was not kind to people who didn't fight back. He'd spent his adult life building a reputation for reliability and fairness. But beneath that calm exterior was something harder, something that had been forged in childhood and tempered by years of difficult work. Jean and Aaron wanted a war. They could have one. But they were about to discover that Roy played by different rules than they'd expected. Over the next 3 weeks, Roy played it cold. He didn't confront Jean directly, didn't make angry phone calls or dramatic scenes. Instead, he built his case with the methodical precision of someone who understood that emotion was the enemy of effective planning. He met with the best divorce attorney in Portland, a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca Martinez who specialized in high-conflict custody cases. She reviewed the evidence from Jean's phone and shook her head in amazement. In 20 years of practice, I've never seen someone document their own fraud this thoroughly, she said. Your wife and Dr. Kells basically created a how-to guide for fabricating domestic abuse allegations. What are my chances of getting full custody? With this evidence? Very good. The family court takes false allegations seriously, especially when they involve coaching a child to lie. Roy also hired a private investigator to follow Jean and Aaron, gathering additional evidence of their relationship and their ongoing conspiracy. The investigator, a former police detective named Tom Walsh, uncovered financial records showing that Aaron had helped Jean open multiple secret accounts and had been transferring money from the Renard family accounts to offshore holdings. They've been bleeding you dry for months, Walsh reported. Nearly $40,000 moved to accounts in Dr. Kell's name. But Roy's most important move was one that Jean and Aaron never saw coming. Working with his attorney, he transferred the deed to their house into a trust fund with Mason as the sole beneficiary. If Jean tried to claim the house in a divorce settlement, she would find that it was no longer Roy's to give. That's brilliant, Rebecca Martinez said when Roy explained what he'd done. Even if she tries to argue for half the marital assets, she can't touch property that belongs to your son. Roy also discovered that Aaron's medical license was already under review by the state board. Someone had filed a complaint about his relationship with Jean, alleging that he'd violated professional boundaries by becoming romantically involved with a therapy patient. The investigation was ongoing, but Aaron's career was effectively over. All the while, Roy maintained the appearance of a man who was falling apart. He showed up to work disheveled and distracted. He let people see him drinking alone at a bar near the construction site. He played the role of the devastated husband who didn't understand what was happening to his life. Jean and Aaron bought the performance completely. He's a mess, Jean told Aaron during one of their phone conversations, which Roy was now recording thanks to surveillance equipment his attorney had obtained through legal channels. He looks terrible. He's drinking. He can barely function at work. Good, Aaron replied. The more unstable he appears, the stronger our case becomes. Keep documenting everything. What they didn't know was that Roy was documenting everything too. Every conversation, every meeting, every move they made was being recorded and cataloged. Detective Hines had obtained warrants for their phones and email accounts, and the evidence against them was growing daily. Then, on a Thursday evening in late October, Roy decided it was time to end the game. He sent Jean a text message from an untraceable phone. Meet me where it started, or everything goes public. Jean stared at the message for a long time before calling Aaron. He wants to meet at the cafe where we first talked. It's a trap. Of course it's a trap. But Aaron, what if he really does have evidence that could destroy us? What if he's been recording our conversations, or following us, or... Jean, you're panicking again. I'm being realistic. Roy isn't stupid. He's been planning something for weeks, and I think we're about to find out what it is. They agreed to meet Roy at the cafe, but they would go together. Whatever Roy was planning, they would face it as a united front. The next evening, Jean and Aaron sat at the same corner table where they'd first discussed leaving Roy 4 months earlier. The cafe was busy with the dinner crowd, couples and friends chatting over coffee and wine, unaware of the drama about to unfold. Jean kept checking her watch, her hands trembling slightly. Aaron appeared calm, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes kept scanning the room. Maybe he's not coming, she said. He'll come. This is too important to him. At exactly 7 o'clock, Roy walked through the front door. He looked different than he had in weeks, cleaner, calmer, like a man who'd found his center again. He spotted them immediately and walked over with measured steps. Jean, Aaron. He sat down across from them, placing Jean's gold phone on the table between them. I believe this belongs to you. Jean stared at the device, her face going pale. How did you? Your son brought it to show and tell. 8-year-olds don't understand the concept of secret phones, apparently. Aaron leaned forward. Roy, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Jean and I are colleagues. We've been working together on some consulting projects. Is that what you call it? Roy's voice was conversational, almost friendly. Consulting projects that involve coaching my wife to fabricate abuse allegations? Consulting projects that involve stealing $40,000 from my bank accounts. Jean's breath caught. Roy, I can explain. I'm sure you can. You've become quite good at explaining things, haven't you? Explaining why you need a secret phone. Explaining why you've been moving our money. Explaining why our son has been having nightmares and acting out at school. Roy picked up the phone and scrolled through the messages. Should I read some of these aloud? I particularly like the one where Aaron tells you to make sure the recording captures Roy's angry voice. Very professional advice for a licensed therapist. Aaron's calm mask was starting to slip. You're taking things out of context. Jean came to me because she was experiencing emotional abuse. I was trying to help her document a dangerous situation. Dangerous situation. Roy repeated the words slowly. You mean the situation where I work 60 hours a week to support my family? Where I've never raised my voice to my wife or my son? Where I've spent 8 years trying to be the kind of husband and father my own father never was? Jean told me about your anger issues, your controlling behavior. Jean told you what you wanted to hear, so you'd help her steal my money and my son. Roy's voice was still calm, but there was steel underneath it now. You manipulated a vulnerable woman into believing her marriage was abusive, so you could justify an affair and theft. Jean found her voice. Roy, please. We can work this out. We can go to counseling. We can work it out. Roy looked at her with something that might have been pity. Jean, you coached our 8-year-old son to lie about abuse. You made recordings trying to get him to say I hit him. There's no coming back from that. The cafe around them had grown quieter, other patrons sensing the tension at their table. Aaron glanced around nervously, then leaned across the table. What do you want, Roy? Money? A quiet divorce? We can make this easy for everyone. Roy smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. You want to know what I want? I want justice. I want my son to grow up knowing that actions have consequences. I want you both to understand what it feels like to lose everything. You can't prove anything, Aaron said, but his voice lacked conviction. Can I? Roy pulled out his own phone and showed them a text message. Detective Hines should be here any minute. She's very interested in talking to both of you about conspiracy to commit fraud, filing false police reports, and child endangerment. Jean's face went white. You call the police? I didn't have to. They've been investigating you for weeks. Turns out, when you coach a child to lie about abuse and then document your conspiracy in text messages, law enforcement tends to take an interest. Aaron stood up abruptly. This is harassment. You're manipulating the situation to make yourself look like the victim. Sit down, Dr. Kells. The new voice came from behind them. Detective Mira Hines approached their table, flanked by two uniformed officers. She looked tired but satisfied, like someone who just solved a particularly complicated puzzle. Dr. Aaron Kells, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, filing false reports, and professional misconduct. She nodded to one of the officers, who moved behind Aaron's chair. Jean Renard, you're under arrest for the same charges, plus child endangerment. This is insane, Jean said, her voice rising. Roy is the abuser. We have evidence. You have fabricated evidence, Detective Hines said calmly. Evidence that you created in text messages that we've been monitoring for 3 weeks. Aaron tried to pull away from the officer, attempting to handcuff him. This is a setup. Roy has been planning this, manipulating the situation. Dr. Kells, Roy said, standing up slowly. You spent 4 months convincing my wife that I was an abuser. You helped her steal my money and coached her to manipulate my son. You used your position as a therapist to exploit a woman who trusted you. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that only Aaron could hear. You both played me, but you used my son. That's unforgivable. As the officers led Jean and Aaron away in handcuffs, the other cafe patrons watched in shocked silence. Jean looked back over her shoulder, her eyes meeting Roy's one last time. Roy, please, don't do this. Think about Mason. I am thinking about Mason, Roy replied. I'm thinking about what kind of world I want him to grow up in. A world where lies have consequences. Roy watched them disappear through the cafe doors, then sat back down at the empty table. The gold phone still lay where he'd placed it, its screen dark and silent. He picked it up and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Evidence. Insurance. A reminder. 6 weeks later, Roy stood in the hallway outside a family court hearing room, straightening Mason's tie. The boy looked nervous in his small suit, but he'd been brave throughout the entire ordeal, answering the judge's questions honestly and clearly. Dad, will I have to see Mom again? The judge will decide what's best for you, buddy. But whatever happens, you'll be safe. Rebecca Martinez emerged from the courtroom with a satisfied expression. The judge granted you full custody. Jean's visitation rights are suspended pending completion of her counseling program and community service. Roy felt a weight lift from his shoulders. What about Aaron? Dr. Kells pleaded guilty to all charges. He'll serve 18 months in prison and pay full restitution for the money he helped steal. His medical license has been permanently revoked. And Jean, 2 years probation, mandatory counseling, and full financial restitution. She'll also have to complete 500 hours of community service focused on domestic violence education. Roy nodded. It was more than fair, considering what they'd attempted to do. That afternoon, Roy and Mason returned to their house for the first time in over a month. Roy had hired a cleaning service to remove any trace of Jean's presence, and the house felt different now. Lighter somehow. While Mason played in the backyard, Roy's phone rang. It was Jean. Roy, please don't hang up. What do you want? I wanted to talk to you about visitation, about seeing Mason. The court will schedule supervised visits when you've completed your counseling program. Roy, please. I know I made mistakes, but I'm his mother. He needs me. Roy looked out the window at Mason, who was building something with blocks on the patio. His son looked happier than he had in months, free from the tension and confusion that had clouded their home for so long. You coached him to lie about abuse, Jean. You put him in the middle of your scheme to destroy his father. You chose Aaron over your own son. I was confused. Aaron made me think. Aaron didn't make you do anything. You made choices. You chose to have an affair. You chose to steal money. You chose to use our son as a weapon. There was silence on the other end of the line. I want to make things right, Jean said finally. I want to be a better person, a better mother. Then do the work. Complete your counseling. Prove that you've changed. But understand something, Jean, I will never trust you again. And I will never forgive what you tried to do to Mason. Roy. He hung up the phone. That evening, while Mason did his homework at the kitchen table, Roy sat in his home office and pulled out Jean's old phone. He scrolled through the messages one more time, reading the evidence of betrayal and manipulation that had nearly destroyed his family. Then he opened his desk drawer and placed the phone inside, next to the legal documents that had restored his life. A reminder of how quickly trust could be broken, how dangerous it was to let his guard down. Roy's voice carried through the house as he called to his son. "Mason, are you ready for dinner?" "Coming, Dad." Roy smiled as he heard Mason's footsteps running down the hall. They would build a new life, just the two of them. A life based on honesty and trust, where Mason would grow up knowing that his father would protect him from anyone who tried to hurt him. The secret phone sat silent in the drawer, its secrets revealed, its power broken. Justice had been served not through violence or emotion, but through patience and preparation. Roy had learned long ago that the strongest revenge was simply ensuring that the truth came to light. Some wounds weren't meant to heal. Some are meant to remind.